Hello everyone. In my next video, I'll be discussing what the existence code actually is. But before we do that, I want to lay the groundwork for some things we need to just really understand and be open-minded to. In my last video, we talked about how knowing is actually an impossible ideal. We never really know anything for sure, and that's okay, and that's good, because it leads us to question. We often have this view of reality that we think, oh, I know this because my experience shows this. But that view of reality is often based off of assumptions. Things that make sense, that explain our experience, but there are often alternate assumptions or alternate views or what ifs, like what if that assumption isn't right? What if this is right instead, that could explain those things even better? And I would say that this is true with the way every one of us sees our reality. Our reality is based off of assumptions, and there are what ifs that if we explored, we could come up with better ways of describing our reality and understanding why things happen. So today's video is going to be discussing assumptions versus what ifs. So this is the second part in the Existence Code series. We shape our reality around assumptions. We've been doing this historically for tens of thousands of years. We shape our reality around assumptions. One of the assumptions that people made for a long time is that the Earth was the center of the universe. Now, this assumption might seem absurd and kind of stupid by today's standards, but think about it. When you go outside and look at the sun moving throughout the day, well, what did I just say? You go outside and you can see what looks like the sun moving throughout the day. If the sun were the center of the solar system, or the universe as they then thought, then would we see it moving? I mean, it actually appears as if the sun is moving around the Earth throughout the day, and that the sun travels around the Earth once per day. So creating a model where we have a picture where the sun is revolving around the Earth doesn't sound so weird, because that describes that aspect of our experience. But then when we start looking at the planets revolving around the Earth, it gets a little bit more complicated, because sometimes they go forwards, in a direction that seems like they're going around the Earth, but then sometimes they go back a little bit and then forwards again. So if we were to describe a model from drawing like a map of the orbits, we'd come up with what Ptolemy came up with in the Ptolemaic system of planets, and it would look something like this, where you have all of these very strange orbital paths of the planets. Now, is this a bad model? Well, there are things it did not explain, yes, but there are a lot of things it did explain that worked well based off of experience. So today we would think, okay, this is a horrible model because we know better, right? But where did that knowing better come from? Well, it came from a what if. And the what if was, well, what if the sun is actually the center of the solar system? And Copernicus came up, or he popularized this idea, and he wasn't the first one to think about this. A lot of people thought about this in the past. But Copernicus popularized the idea that the sun is actually the center of the solar system, that all the planets orbit around the sun. And he originally said they orbited around in circles like this. But, I mean, this kind of described observation to a degree, but it didn't quite describe the motion of the planets, because we could tell they didn't revolve around in perfect circles. No matter how hard we tried to make it happen, the observations showed us differently. But that what if still stood out in people's minds, because it was a much simpler view of the reality of our solar system. So Kepler came along and he came up with Kepler's laws that described the motion of the planets around the sun in ellipses instead of in perfect circles. And that actually solved the problem pretty well, where it described the motion of the planets and we were able to make a model. Now that combined with Newton's law of universal gravitation came up with a pretty decent model of how the planets should orbit. But even then, it didn't quite predict the orbit of Mercury. And it wasn't until Albert Einstein came along and said, you know what, gravity is actually caused by curvatures in space-time. It's not really a force at all. It's caused by curvatures in space-time. Space-time itself is actually curved, kind of like if you put a giant bowling ball on a trampoline, the trampoline is going to bend down. And if you put other balls near the bowling ball, they'll roll towards it because the space-time of the trampoline is bent, right? So that then helped us recreate the current model where we now understand and can predict very accurately the orbits of the planets around the sun. So all of these changes in the current model of our solar system came from questioning assumptions and saying, well, what if this is the case? I mean, originally, there was the assumption the sun and all the planets revolve around the Earth. But, that even started out as a what if, right? What if the sun and all the planets revolve around the Earth? And that explains what we're seeing in the sky. Because, to understand that, you'd have to understand that there's circular motion happening. And that, back then, was an assumption, because it's not like people could step outside of the Earth and look at things back then, like we can now in spacecrafts. And then we came along with the, well, what if that isn't true? What if the sun is the center? But that didn't quite fit the description of reality. So we had to say, well, what if they're not perfect circles? What if they're ellipses? And then we had to see if that fit reality, and there were some things it didn't quite describe. So Einstein said, well, what if gravity is actually the bending of space-time itself? And from that we came up with our current model, which is pretty good. But, we could go even further, couldn't we? What if there's some other factor that we're missing, and this view of the solar system is actually not the best way of seeing things? So here we're just looking at an example of the solar system. But let's think of a lot of assumptions that the entire structure of our reality in science, in physics, and in everyday life is structured around. So we have so many different assumptions that we build our worldview and our perspective of reality off of. And as we discussed in our last video, we only see like 10 to 30% of visual information, and the other 70 to 90% is actually our brain making up stuff based off of our understanding and prediction of our worldview. So, maybe even altering the way we understand reality will alter the way we see reality. Anyway, let's look at these assumptions that we make currently that have structured our current view of reality. That time is linear. What does this mean? It means that the past is gone, it's in the past. And we are in the present, and the present is always progressing forward into the future in like a straight line, but you could just map it out and say, okay, we could make a timeline. That's the thing, right? We make timelines and we act like time is linear. This happened then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and we can put it all in a nice line. That is actually an assumption. That is not what I would call a physical reality. Okay, the next assumption. There's only one past reality that led to the present. So we assume that because we are here in the present, that the past is some concrete thing that never changes. It is just this static thing, and there was only one past that led to the now. The next assumption is that light travels from one point to the other like a ping pong ball, where the light source is the paddle hitting the ball, and the ball bounces off into the next paddle as the player hits it. So it's this idea that light travels like a ball being shot out of something from one point to the next. The next assumption is that every day we wake up in the same reality. So if I go to sleep and I wake up, I'm in the exact same realm of existence that I was before I went to sleep. Seems reasonable, but is it actually provable? Another assumption is that object permanence is a thing. Yeah, object permanence is actually an assumption. So what do we mean? What do I mean by this? That things continue to exist even if we don't observe them. Okay. And then the next assumption. Light can be emitted without eventually being absorbed. This is an assumption that the entire framework of physics is really built off of, that light exists as an independent entity. It doesn't matter if it's been absorbed or will be absorbed, or even if it has been emitted, light can just exist like a particle in space, traveling from one point to the next. So this actually goes along with this assumption here. The next assumption is that every particle of matter is unique, separate, and distinct. Now, I just picked a bunch of assumptions just kind of out of my mind, but there are millions of assumptions that we make, that we structure our reality around. I picked these assumptions because I think they're some of the more interesting ones to explore, and the existence code touches on a lot of these. Okay, so most of us accept all these things as true, as fact. But let's look at the what-ifs. What-ifs can entirely change the way that we see and view and structure our reality. What if the past, present, and future are actually the same thing? Einstein himself said that the difference between the past, present, and future is just a persistent illusion. So, what if they were actually the same thing? What if the past, present, and future all exist somehow in the same state? What if they're inseparable from each other? What if an event in the future can change the past? An event in the past can change the future? And what if they're all just interwoven rather than a line? And this is actually something that modern physics kind of accepts, that the past, present, and future are not all separate and distinct. Yet, when we teach physics, we kind of still make that previous assumption that time is linear. It's quite confusing. Okay, let's go to the next what if. What if there are infinite possible pasts that led to the present? What if every possible reality that could have led to this present state of existence is real, is just as real? In other words, every possible reality that led to this moment in time is a real alternate reality. And what if all those alternate realities exist together and influence the present until we discover our past and link ourselves to one of those realities by creating a chain of cause and effect and a chain of evidence that links us backwards? And what if light doesn't travel at all? What if light actually exists as connections outside of space-time, where it's connecting entities and transferring energy but in a way that that happens outside of time. And that's why the speed of light seems to be the cosmic speed limit, where nothing can go faster than that, because actually light isn't going anyway. What if every time we wake up, we're in different realities, and our memories are just reshaped depending on the new reality that we're in? Now, this one I don't particularly believe in, but I think it's kind of fun to think about. I mean, it could be the case. What if? These are our what ifs. I'm not saying this is the way it is. What if reality only renders the objects we are currently detecting? So, if you want to make a video game or a computer program that uses memory efficiently, you don't want it to have all of this information you're not currently displaying on the screen in memory, unless you need it there for some reason. So what if reality itself just stops updating things that we're not interacting with? Like, each one of us has our own reality in a way, where the only things that exist are the things that we are detecting with our senses. Would that make reality more efficient somehow? I don't know. Is there any way of proving that that's not how it is? I don't know. It doesn't seem so. What if reality only renders the objects we're currently detecting? That's an interesting one. Okay, what if light cannot be emitted unless the light will eventually be absorbed? This is one that I've received criticism for asking this question as a physicist, where people say, well, I mean, it's like the particle that's going to absorb it has to know ahead of time, or the particle that's emitting it has to know ahead of time that there's going to be a particle absorbing it in the end. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's like somehow these particles are precognitive. But what they don't understand is that, okay, if this first assumption is true, that light actually doesn't travel, it exists as a connection outside of this worldview of space-time, then we know that there really isn't a before and after in the emission and absorption, that they can be the same event. Now, if we make this alternate assumption, it leads to an entirely different way of viewing reality that I think is quite beautiful. Now, what if there's only one electron, and we share that one electron all the time? So we think there are just billions of electrons in the universe. But every electron is identical except for its position in space-time. So what if every electron is actually the same structure, but it's just being repeated over and over again throughout space-time, and we're just all sharing that same structure? What if the neutron is just all one neutron that we're all sharing, that's being like repeated over and over again? It's like being executed in the memory of space-time over and over and over again. So what if there is only one of each of these fundamental particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, and we're all just sharing them? Now this idea, this what if, isn't actually one of my theories. This is a what if that someone, I don't know the name, but they came up with a very long time ago. Physicists have wondered about things like this for a long time. So, with all this in mind, I just want you to think about what are the assumptions that you are making, that you frame and structure your reality around. Are a lot of your assumptions religious? A lot of them might be. Do you assume that when you die you're going to go somewhere to heaven or to hell or whatever? Is there evidence to show that? And if so, how are you interpreting that evidence? Do you assume that... I mean, and there's so many assumptions we can make. Some people assume that men are smarter than women, and that's like a really sexist and stupid assumption, but a lot of people think that that's true, and they teach it to their children, and we have this whole sexist worldview that evolves from that. And it's not until something is presented that challenges those assumptions that people are led to change their minds. So I just want you to think about what are all of the assumptions that you make. And then attach a what if to each of those assumptions. Just make something up. Like, okay, we assume based off of our experience that when we jump, we will eventually fall down. But what if we're not actually falling down? What if the Earth is accelerating up towards us? I mean, that one might seem a little bit silly, but Einstein kind of showed that through his equivalence principle, acceleration is equivalent to gravity. They're exactly equivalent in so many ways. So that might seem silly, but I mean that's actually how in the Amazon series, The Expanse, the sci-fi series, The Expanse, that's how the spaceships generate artificial gravity, and that is how we actually could create artificial gravity. So there are a lot of silly what-ifs we could come up with that can lead to some pretty interesting discoveries. Now, the reason why I wanted to go over all of this is to help you start getting in the right mindset to understand what I'm going to present, but also because in order to understand where the existence code comes from and the evidence behind it, we have to challenge so many of the assumptions that we have made. And I want to show you that if we challenge those assumptions like we did in the past, when we had the assumption that the Earth was the center, if we challenge the assumptions that we currently have, then we can go from a worldview that is as enlightening, a change in our worldview that is as enlightening as it was to go from the Ptolemaic system of planets to our current planetary model. So right now, in our model of existence and reality as we see it in our culture, in our religions, in our sciences, that model is very similar to the Ptolemaic view. It's archaic, really. There is a better, simpler way of explaining reality, and that is what the existence code is. It's a better, simpler way of explaining reality where we can go from something extremely complex and convoluted like this to something beautiful and elegant like this. Okay, I'm going to leave those thoughts with you, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and next time I'll delve into what the existence code actually is. Till next time, take care.